Snow fell without apology, quiet and endless, like heaven had turned its back and whispered nothing. It covered every footprint in minutes. No trace left of the horses, the wagon, or the fine preacher's boots that had once trod toward the chapel. There was no music. No supper waiting. Just white silence and a girl in a wedding dress, trembling by the steps of the old mountain church. Juniper Wade did not cry. Not when she was told, in front of 10 guests and no groom, that there would be no wedding. Not when the preacher cleared his throat and avoided her eyes. Not when the mother of the would-be groom slipped a folded handkerchief into Juniper's glove, with an expression more of relief than sorrow. And certainly not when the town's matron, Mrs. Haskell, leaned over and murmured, "These things happen when you come from mud and try to walk marble floors, dear." She stood there long after the last buggy rattled off, white veil twitching in the wind like a ghost refusing to leave. Her fingers, red from cold, clutched a bouquet made of wild yarrow and pine needles, picked by her own hands the morning before, because no one in the groom's family wanted to waste florals on charity. The yarrow had wilted, and she tucked it under her arm as if it still meant something. She walked down the chapel steps, past the long stone wall where children used to play tag in the summer, through the frozen gate into the pine woods. Her boots, too small and more ceremonial than practical, slipped on the icy path. Her dress, once white, was now tinged with soot from the church hearth and brown water from the melted snow. The wind picked up like a sermon. The town watched her from behind frosted windows. Faces hidden behind lace curtains. Mr. Thornby at the mercantile muttered, "She had no dowry, not even land." Boy came to his senses. His wife said nothing but lit another candle as the girl passed. By the time she reached the edge of town, her legs trembled beneath the satin. She clutched her arms to her chest, teeth chattering not from cold but from the sudden, dreadful stillness. There was nowhere to go. Her belongings had already been moved to the groom's house earlier that week, now barred to her. The boarding house locked its doors at night. And her uncle, who'd brought her west from Arkansas, had left for California months ago. She chose the church stable. It was old and half-broken, used now only to store rusted tools and hay. But it had a roof. She crawled beneath the saddle rack and tucked herself into the shadows like an unwanted letter. The snow kept falling. She did not sleep. She watched it drift through the broken slats above and land on the wood with soft sighs. Somewhere far off, a wolf howled. Or maybe it was just the wind, telling her even the wild had more use for its pack than she did. By morning, her lips were pale and her hands slow to move. She woke to the sound of hooves, heavy ones, not dainty like the sheriff's gelding or showy like the pastor's roan. These were the kind that knew mountain trails and didn't need shoeing for vanity. She didn't move, just stared ahead as the stall doors creaked open. And there he stood. The man. Tala Blackhorse, the Comanche widower who lived above the timberline, and came to town only when the snow grew too high to trap elk. His height was not a rumor. Nor were his silence or his solitude. He wore no coat, just layered hides and a thick blanket over one shoulder. A scar ran down his neck, pale against skin that had seen both sun and battle. He didn't speak. Only looked at her. Long enough to see she was not asleep. Not dead. Just half gone from shame. He stepped forward and placed something on the floor between them. A folded bundle. Thick wool, smelling of smoke and cedar. Then he crouched and laid a bundle of split pine and flint by the hearth, though the hearth was nothing but a cracked stone ring and old ash. He turned to go. No invitation. No judgment. Just a presence that said, "This is yours if you want it." She blinked, unsure if he had truly come, or if her freezing mind had made a man out of snowfall and firewood. But the warmth was real when she pressed the blanket around her shoulders. The pine, dry and clean. Her hands moved before thought did, and she struck flint to stone. The fire caught. It snapped once like a heartbeat. By dusk, the snow was heavier. The sky bruised purple, and wind dragged along the roofs with long groaning sighs. She stayed in the stable, staring at the flames as if they might change something inside her. Then came the second sound. Not hooves this time, but the door creaking open again. Tala stepped in. This time with a tin cup of stew, steam rising from it like a promise. He didn't hand it to her. He placed it beside the fire. Backed away. Let her choose. You don't have to say yes, he murmured. His voice was deep and weathered, like pine rubbed against stone. But you'll die out here. Snow doesn't wait for sorrow. She didn't answer. But her hand moved. Toward the cup. He didn't smile. Just nodded once and stood, silent and unmoving as she drank. The stew was thick. Beans, wild onion, elk fat. It burned all the way down and made her eyes sting. She looked at him for the first time. Not the way one looks at a man, but like someone checking the sky to see if the storm's passed. His expression was unreadable. But his hands were empty. No rope. No brand. No hunger. He took a breath, then spoke again. I ain't a preacher. And I don't want a woman who don't want to be here. But my roof is whole, and my fire's strong. You need a place. And I need someone who ain't afraid to sit quiet. Her lips parted, but no words came. The firelight caught in her hair, turning the broken veil into gold strands over her face. She shook her head, a slow, trembling no. And he didn't argue. He simply walked back into the snow, his footprints filling fast behind him. But just before the wind swallowed him, he stopped. I'll leave a light, he said over his shoulder. Come if you want. If not, no shame. The snow rose in flurries, sweeping his form away like ash. Juniper stayed by the fire until the flames dwindled to red breath. Her fingers played with the edge of the wool blanket. She thought of the bride she was supposed to be, the wife she almost became, the woman she never had the chance to learn to be. Then she rose, took the pine from the floor, tucked it into her bodice, and stepped barefoot into the snow. It was bitter cold, yes. But she could see the light glowing from the ridge, a soft amber pulse like someone waiting. She didn't run. She walked, each step silent, not toward a man, but toward a fire that had been lit, for her. Juniper didn't remember the walk. Just the snow rising past her ankles and the wool blanket dragging like a bridal train in retreat. The sky was dim, not quite night, not yet morning. Her breath bloomed in front of her like prayers whispered too late. When she reached the top of the rise, the cabin appeared. Not grand, not glowing, but sturdy, waiting, with a single amber light flickering behind the shuttered window. She hesitated at the door. There were no flowers, no welcome mat, no sign this place had ever known a woman. Just stacked firewood, a broken horseshoe nailed above the lintel, and the faint scent of juniper smoke from the chimney. She lifted her hand but didn't knock. The door opened before she could. Tala stood in the doorway, as still as a carved idol. He didn't speak. He only stepped back, leaving space. Not an invitation. A choice. She entered. Inside, the cabin breathed with warmth, but none of the softness she'd known in her mother's house long ago. The floor was worn pine, swept clean. The hearth burned low. A table, rough-hewn and wide, bore no tablecloth, only a knife and some bundled herbs. Along the wall hung pelts, tan bear, fox, deer, folded with care, not displayed for pride but stored for use. A rifle leaned near the door. And beyond the hearth, a curtain of beads swayed gently in the draught. Her eyes paused there. Tala followed her gaze, then walked past her to the hearth, stoking the fire with a practiced rhythm. Sparks jumped. He added a log, then turned to her. There's a corner bed made ready. You can have it. I sleep by the stove. She didn't move. The heat of the room thawed the frost from her skin, but the shame clung colder. He poured water from a kettle into a tin cup and handed it to her. Their fingers touched only for a breath. She felt the calluses on his hands, clean, dry, and worn from years of tools, not violence. There's bread. Not fresh. Still good. She took the water but not the bread. Her body trembled too hard to eat. She managed a whisper. Thank you. He nodded and stepped away, not waiting for more. When she lay down, it was in a bed barely wider than a coffin, with wool blankets smelling of smoke and cedar. Her old veil she used as a pillowcase. The snow howled against the window panes, but inside was steady silence. She dreamed of nothing. At dawn, the world was gray with light, and the sound of chopping echoed from outside. She peered through the window to find Tala splitting wood bare-armed in the snow, steam rising from his shoulders like breath from a beast. He didn't notice her watching. Or maybe he did and chose to give her that privacy anyway. Later, he returned, stomping the snow from his boots. He didn't greet her. Just placed the fresh wood beside the hearth and poured himself a bowl of stew. He didn't ask if she wanted any. But when he sat to eat, he slid a second bowl across the table. She took it. They ate in silence. Afterward, she began cleaning, slowly, carefully, first the dishes, then the corner where old ash had settled. He didn't ask her to. But he didn't stop her either. It became habit. She watched how he moved, deliberate and quiet, as if he'd lived years avoiding the creak of floorboards or the snap of twigs. His boots were always left near the door, soles facing east. He sharpened his knives every Sunday morning, and spoke to no one for hours after sunrise. She noticed he kept a worn leather pouch near his bedside, but never opened it in her presence. And he never crossed the bead-curtained room. When she finally dared to ask, her voice barely carried. "What's behind the curtain?" He didn't lift his gaze from the fire. Just answered, "The life I already lost." She didn't ask again. Word of her disappearance had reached the town. Juniper knew by the whispers. Sheriff Keller rode up once and asked if she was safe. Tala didn't answer. He simply looked at Juniper, waiting for her to speak. She stood beside him, spine straight. "I'm not a prisoner." The sheriff tipped his hat, uncertain, and left without more. But others spoke louder. The saloon murmured that she'd gone, savage. Mrs. Haskell declared she'd sold her virtue for stew. Even Pearl and Nettie, her former groom's sisters, were heard giggling behind church pews. Should have known she'd end up in a wigwam. Tala said nothing of it. But his chopping grew harder. The trees behind the cabin stood shaved to stumps before winter's end. That night, Juniper found him sitting by the fire, holding a wooden carving in his hands, a small bird, unfinished. His thumb rubbed the grain slowly, as if remembering what softness felt like. She sat across from him. "My name is still Juniper Wade," she said quietly. "I don't want to be his. Not anymore." He looked up, studying her. His eyes weren't fierce. Just deep, like the bottom of a river that never stirs. "I ain't asking for anything from you," he said. "Not your name. Not your shame." She smiled faintly. "What if I want to give something?" He hesitated. Then rose, walked to the bead curtain and lifted it, not stepping through. Just parting the veil. She followed him. Inside was a room no larger than a prayer. A single bed with faded blankets. A comb. A dress folded in cedarwood. A small cradle, empty but whole. "She died birthing our child," he said. The words were dry, delivered like stone. "He died too." Juniper looked at the cradle, its curves smooth from years of sanding. "I never took another woman here. Never thought I would. Still don't know if I should." She reached forward, fingertips brushing the edge of the cradle. "I'm not asking to replace anyone." He let the curtain fall. After that, something changed. Not quickly. Not in grand declarations. But in how he began to leave her tea on the table in the morning. In how she started folding his shirts the way she once did for her father. In how they never touched hands, but both reached for the same piece of firewood and paused. Breath held, fingers close. She started stitching new pillowcases. He mended the shutters near her bed. Quiet gestures. Nothing spoken. One morning, he found her at the table, humming softly as she mended a rip in his coat. Her voice faltered when she saw him, ashamed of her comfort. But he didn't stop her. "I knew your voice would be warm," he said simply. It was not love. Not yet. But it was something human. And it was more than either of them had known in years. That evening, Juniper stood outside while snowflakes drifted down like bits of burned paper. She saw the town below, just a line of distant lights flickering like judgmental eyes. She whispered into the wind, "I am not who they said I was." Behind her, Tala stepped out and handed her a cup of warm cider. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The snow fell. The fire crackled inside. And between them, Something silent and alive had begun to breathe. By late winter, the silence between them had grown thick, but it no longer felt like absence. It felt like understanding. The cabin held warmth now. Not just from the hearth, but from the rhythm of two people living near, not upon each other. Her stitches marked the blankets. His hands had mended the leaking roof. She dried herbs from the windowsill and pressed them into jars. He placed the jars on a shelf he carved with his own blade. There were no titles exchanged. No roles named aloud. But everything slowly, carefully, became ours. Still, they never touched. Not truly. Not unless a bowl was passed or a coat adjusted. Not unless their shoulders accidentally brushed when both reached for the same log. And when it happened, neither of them breathed for several heartbeats. As if the quiet fire between them might flare up and demand something they weren't ready to give. Juniper had stopped waiting for questions. Tala never asked why she'd been abandoned, or why the veil she once wore now lined the cradle in the beaded room. But she could feel his knowing in the way he moved, like a man who understood grief didn't always look like tears. It sometimes looked like cooking when no one asked you to, or sitting by the door because you weren't sure you were allowed to rest on the bed. In those small things, he made space. And in her quiet, she filled it. One evening, while mending the sleeve of his buckskin coat, Juniper found a bloodstain hidden in the seam. Old, brown, and stubborn. She rubbed it gently with water, but it didn't lift. She didn't ask about it. But that night, he said, "Raiders came through years ago. Took our horses. Shot my brother's boy. I wore that coat for 3 days tracking them." She looked up. "I didn't find the horses," he added. "But I buried the boy." Laid his rifle across his chest. Her hands paused mid-stitch. "I think you carry your grief different than I do," she said softly. He nodded once. "Yours sings. Mine just burns." The wind howled that night. Long and low, like an animal calling something home. Snow tapped the windows like fingers. But inside the cabin, the warmth never faltered. She began humming more. Mostly when she thought he wasn't listening. Lullabies from Arkansas. Pieces of old hymns her mother once sang. Tala would carve wood while she worked, shaping spoons, bowls, a single flute he never played. And though he didn't hum, he stopped carving when she sang, as if he couldn't bear to divide the moment. One morning, she found a pine carving on her pillow. A small bird, wings tucked in. No note. No explanation. But when she held it in her palm, it felt warm, like someone had carried it there before the sun came up. She tucked it into her pocket and didn't thank him aloud. Just looked him in the eye and smiled. Barely. He turned away quickly, but she saw it. The ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. But not all the world softened with snow and kindness. Word spread. Whispers thickened like storm clouds down in the valley. That she had no shame. That she'd gone wild. That he had bewitched her. Pearl and Nettie had taken to spreading tales in the general store, claiming she'd been seen walking around the cabin half-naked. Lies, but the kind that townsfolk liked to believe. Sheriff Keller came again. This time, with eyes more narrowed than concerned. "I need to know if you're being kept," he said plainly. "Or if you've forgotten what's proper." Juniper stared at him. The pine bird weighed heavy in her skirt pocket. "I've forgotten nothing," she replied. "And I'm not kept. I'm warm. I'm fed. I'm safe." The sheriff gave Tala a long look. "The town's uneasy. If she ain't your wife, she shouldn't be under your roof." Tala's voice was gravel. "She's not under my roof. She's beside it." The sheriff left with his hat lower than he came in, and a warning that the church ladies were writing letters to the circuit pastor. Later, as Juniper gathered firewood near the edge of the treeline, she saw 2 riders watching from the ridge. She said nothing. But that night, she moved her sleeping mat closer to the hearth. Closer to where he lay. He didn't speak. He didn't shift. But she saw his hand drift just slightly, fingers open. Not toward her, but near enough that the space between them pulsed with unspoken things. She dreamed of running. Not away. But toward. Into a warmth she didn't have to earn. When she awoke, the morning was fog-heavy. Tala was gone. She found him out near the barn, carving something into a plank. At first, she thought it was just the firewood pile again. But when she stepped closer, she saw it, her name. Not full. Not loud. Just J. Wade in deep grooves. He didn't look up when she approached. I needed to mark your place. For the stock. For the land. She touched the rough letters with her fingers. It's not my land. He finally met her gaze. It could be. She didn't answer. But her breath came shallow. Her eyes blurred from more than cold. Inside, she took down the scrap of her wedding dress from the cradle. Held it in her lap. It had become something else now. Not a symbol of rejection, but of what she'd survived. And suddenly, she didn't want to survive anymore. She wanted to live. That evening, she made soup from roots and dried rabbit. Lit candles even when the fire didn't need help. Brushed her hair not for vanity, but because she wanted to feel herself worthy of being seen. When Tala came in, snow in his hair and shoulders dusted with frost, she looked up. I used to think I had to be chosen, she said. He set his axe down slowly. I don't anymore. He walked toward her slow. Not like a man ready to take something, but like a man ready to receive whatever she gave freely. I never meant to make you feel owned, he said. You didn't. They stood that way for a long time. The fire cracked between them. The pine bird sat on the mantel now, beside a jar of herbs she'd dried. The wind outside wailed, but neither moved. And then, she stepped forward. Just once. Just close enough for her fingers to brush the back of his hand. Still, they didn't kiss. They didn't claim. But in that one gesture, something deeper passed between them than vows ever could. When she pulled her hand away, he looked at her like a man who had once buried his heart, and now saw it breathing again. You hungry? She asked, breaking the stillness. His eyes softened. For the first time in a long while. Snow still blanketed the high ridge, but it no longer felt like silence. It felt like a warning. Juniper knew the look of a day too still, too clear. When the air seemed to hold its breath. When the birds kept low and even the wind waited. Tala had gone to split kindling by the barn, but she could feel something rising behind the pines. She was drying her hands on her apron when she heard the crunch of hooves. Not one horse. Not two. Many. She stepped onto the porch just as the riders crested the hill. 7 in all, with faces tight beneath scarves, rifles sheathed but close to hand. In the lead rode Sheriff Keller, gray dusting his mustache, and eyes heavy with discomfort. Behind him came Mrs. Haskell, wrapped in furs, sitting ramrod straight on a dainty sorrel mare. And beside her, Pearl and Nettie Crane, still wearing their smug, church-polished Sunday faces, though it was Saturday, and there was nothing holy about their mission. Juniper stepped off the porch. She wore no veil now. No dress of rejection. Just a homespun skirt and a wool shawl Tala had stitched for her with bear fur at the collar. Her hair was braided back with pine needles she'd picked herself. Her hands didn't tremble. Sheriff Keller dismounted and approached, hat in hand. Miss Wade. Mrs. Haskell insisted, he began, that we come up here, peacefully. The matron interjected before he could finish. We came to bring her back. Before her shame stains this whole territory. Juniper's chin lifted slightly. I wasn't aware the air could be stained by a woman surviving. Pearl scoffed. You weren't surviving. You were. But her voice faltered when Tala stepped around the side of the cabin. He was shirtless beneath a heavy buffalo cloak, chest rising with quiet power. Axe still in hand. Not raised. Not threatening. Just present. The horses shifted. Even Mrs. Haskell hesitated. Tala met no one's gaze but Juniper's. He gave the smallest of nods, nothing more. Sheriff Keller cleared his throat again. Town's uneasy. The church, the mayor's office, a few folks feel this situation's improper. If she were your wife, it'd be different. She's not a possession, Tala said, voice calm. Nor a prisoner. But she's not your wife, Mrs. Haskell pressed. She's not even your kind. The insult hung there. Pearl whispered, she's lost her mind. Living like this. Sleeping in a beast's den. Juniper took a step forward. I sleep under a roof. I eat warm meals. I patch blankets and hang herbs, and I sing when I feel like it. I have silence when I need it. And never once have I been touched without permission. The matron's lips curled. You're young. Easily swayed. I was young when your son left me standing in snow, Juniper said softly. I was young when you whispered that my father's drinking made me unfit to marry into your family. I was young when you all turned away from me without a word. Mrs. Haskell blinked, thrown off by the steadiness in her tone. You never gave me anything but judgment, Juniper continued. But here on this mountain, I was given wood to burn, food to eat, a place to sleep, and no shame for crying when I needed to. Keller tried to speak, but the matron cut him off. You're bewitched. No, Juniper said. I was believed. A long silence followed. Then Tala stepped forward. She stays if she wants to. Mrs. Haskell turned her eyes to him, ice cold. You think you can defy a whole town? I don't care about towns, he said. I care about fires that stay lit, and hands that don't tremble when they're holding a spoon. She makes this place better. Brighter. Keller shifted, clearly uncomfortable. We won't force her. But there'll be consequences. No church will recognize this. No preacher'll marry it. And if you have children. He didn't finish. Tala didn't blink. We'll raise them in snow, not under shame. The riders began to murmur. Mrs. Haskell turned her horse with a sneer. Then you'll have no part of town. No support. No charity. Don't come begging when you need a midwife or a coffin. Good, Juniper whispered. Then we'll owe you nothing. Pearl turned in her saddle. You were supposed to cry. To regret. That's what you were supposed to do. Juniper stepped closer, voice low but clear. I did cry. But not because I lost something. I cried because for once, I found something that didn't try to fix me or forget me. The sheriff touched the brim of his hat again, less certain now. Come down when the snow clears, he said gently. If you change your mind. But she didn't answer. Not with words. She walked to Tala and stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. She reached up, took his hand and rested it in her own. Not as ownership. Not as proof. But as choice. The riders turned. Their horses trotted away without farewell. Hooves faded into the pines. For a long time after, Juniper and Tala stood in the snow, fingers still joined, watching the trail where judgment had come and gone. Later, inside, she placed a kettle on the fire. They'll come again, she said. Yes. Will they bring more? Maybe. She poured water into 2 cups. Added herbs she dried last week. Sat beside him on the floor, knees just brushing. I don't need the town, she whispered. I just need someone who doesn't vanish when it gets cold. He looked at her, firelight catching in the curve of her cheek. I'm here. And for the first time, she let her head rest on his shoulder. Slowly. Quietly. Without apology. Outside, snow began to fall again. But this time, it felt like something sacred, like the world was being washed clean for what came next. 3 days passed in quiet preparation. No preacher came. No church bells rang. But the fire inside the cabin never dimmed, and Juniper's hands worked steadily, mending, stitching, sweeping with a rhythm that felt like belonging. Tala didn't ask what she was doing. But he built. Outside in the frozen morning, he shaped a cedar arch from split beams and bound them with hide strips. He adorned it not with flowers but with feathers and pine cones, bits of tan leather, the soft thread from rabbit tails. No audience was invited. No announcement sent. Yet somehow, word traveled like wind through brittle branches. At dawn on the 3rd day, a trail of footprints appeared leading from the town to the high ridge. Old Tobias came first, limping up with his fiddle under one arm, muttering about whiskey and second chances. Behind him walked Hawk, Tala's old friend, bringing a wrapped bundle of smoked meat and a flask carved with Comanche patterns. And slowly, others followed. Quietly, as if stumbling into a sacred grove they hadn't expected. Mrs. Haskell did not come. But Sheriff Keller stood near the treeline, hat in hand, saying nothing. Pearl and Nettie hovered behind a wagon wheel, faces unreadable. Inside the cabin, Juniper stared at herself in the polished basin. She wore a dress pieced together from the remnants of her ruined wedding gown, and a tanned hide Tala had left beside her sewing basket weeks ago. The result was something between settler and savage. Soft white fabric trimmed with wild fur, stitched with strands of horsehair and cedar thread. Her braid was wound with pine needles and a single blue feather. She didn't look like a bride. She looked like someone who had walked through fire and come out warm. Tala waited outside, beside the arch, dressed in a clean shirt of undyed linen and dark buckskin pants. His feet were bare. He held nothing, needed nothing. He stood with the patience of the mountain behind him. Juniper stepped outside. The hush that fell over the guests was not for beauty. It was for what they saw on her face, peace without apology. She joined him beneath the arch. They exchanged no rings. No vows in English or Comanche. No declarations before God or man. Instead, Tala stepped forward with a small knife and carved her name, Juniper Wade, beside his own, already etched into the doorpost of the cabin. The carving was not deep, but it was permanent. Then he handed the blade to her. She hesitated, the steel cool in her palm. She turned it gently, and carved one more word beneath the names. Home. Old Tobias played a hymn on his fiddle. Hawk raised a prayer in soft Comanche, voice barely above the breeze. A child placed wildflowers at the couple's feet. No one applauded. But someone wept. Pearl. She didn't hide it. She simply stood there, arms wrapped around herself, watching a woman she had once pitied glow like a fire unstamped. Sheriff Keller approached after the ceremony, eyes respectful. No paper for this union. No signature. Tala nodded. Don't need paper to stay. Only to leave. Juniper added. We carved it. That's enough. The sheriff smiled faintly and extended his hand. Then I won't argue it. Congratulations. Later, the guests shared stew and cider in silence, sitting on logs and blankets outside the cabin as snow flurried like confetti sent from a distant heaven. No laughter, but warmth. A different kind of celebration. The kind that grows slowly. Like roots. At sunset, the last of the visitors departed, leaving behind only the arch, the flowers, and the impressions of footprints slowly filling with snow. Juniper stood at the doorway, arms folded, watching the horizon blur with dusk. Tala stepped beside her. They came, she said softly. He nodded. Because they knew you wouldn't kneel. She smiled. Neither would you. Inside, the fire crackled low. She reached for the pine bird still resting on the mantel, holding it in her palm. I kept this, she whispered, even before I understood what it meant. He placed his hand over hers. It means you're not alone. They stood there, side by side, not as legend or spectacle, but as something smaller and more enduring. Two souls who had survived exile. Not by fighting the world, but by refusing to believe it had the last word. As night settled over the high ridge, Juniper and Tala lay beneath quilts she had sewn and he had tanned, the cradle still empty, but the cabin full. Outside, wind sang through the trees, soft and low. Inside, no more words were needed. So if you're listening, wherever you are, and whatever pain still weighs in your chest, remember this. Some homes are not found. They're built. Quietly. By hands that don't demand, by hearts that wait, and by the fire that stays lit through every snowfall. Not every vow is spoken. Some are carved. And some are simply lived.